Now, the coincidence that our Edmund Burke Award this year should follow so closely upon the publication of Andrew's magisterial biography of Winston Churchill is pregnant with adumbrations, emanations, and significances. You'll soon be able to see for yourself, for we have a copy of Andrew's book waiting for all of you upon your departure. The subtitle of Andrew's book is Walking with Destiny. It is not too much to say that this 1,100-page biography, 1,105 for the sticklers among you, is a book that Andrew was destined to write. As he noted recently in an interview, he had already written 5 books with the name Churchill in the title or subtitle, and more than 200 articles and book reviews about the great man. On becoming Prime Minister in 1940, Churchill said that he felt, quote, as if all my past life was but a preparation for this hour and this trial. Andrew has said that he felt similarly about undertaking this biography, that all his previous work were but prolegomenon for this opus. Now, I think that there are deep intellectual and moral similarities between Winston Churchill and Andrew Roberts. You cannot read 5 pages of Churchill's sinewy prose without recognizing its frank, out-of-doors quality. It is, if I may employ an antique and deprecated word, manly prose. Forthright, eloquent without being epicene, robustly straightforward, and impatient of what we today call political correctness. It is writing about the most exigent human realities cast in a style that is moving but never sentimental, introverted, or overripe. Andrew, in his journalism as well as his histories and biographies, commands a similarly high-octane prose, ever attentive to the drama of mankind's adventures in time that the world historical personages that he writes about embody in their actions. Now, there's something deeply Victorian about the writing of both Churchill and Andrew Roberts. I use the adjective not in its contemporary, decayed sense of stuffy or prim or moralistic, but on the contrary, in its highest and truest sense of something energetic and full of cultural confidence. It is noonday prose, full of light and full of action. Winston Churchill was intimately involved in the 20th century's great battles between good and evil. The battle against Prussian militarism in the teens, against the horrors of Nazism in the 30s and 40s, and then against the soul-blighting tyranny of Soviet communism, whose shadow we still have with us. He was never in any doubt that those movements were evil, or that the cause of Britain, and later of Britain and America together, represented a wholesome and life-enhancing alternative. Churchill, that is to say, was an unapologetic advocate for the values of what we today call the Anglosphere, for the rule of law, for the free market, for individual liberty underwritten by the embrace of duty and responsibility. He wrote a huge book about those values called A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, which began with Caesar's invasion of Britannia in 55 BC and ends in the opening years of the 20th century. Now this is not the Calcutta phone book. This is my copy of Andrew Roberts' continuation of Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples from 1900 until the day before yesterday. And those of you with eagle eyes will surmise from the numerous red flags that decorate the pages of this book that it's something I have devoted considerable study to. And you would be right. The fruit of that study, in a word, is an affirmation of that robust cultural self-confidence of which I spoke. Andrew, like Churchill, has no hesitation in celebrating the values of the Anglosphere in preference to the squalid, if owlish, interventions of the continent and beyond. Like Churchill, he understands that socialism, and I'm quoting Churchill's famous description, is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. Churchill and Andrew Roberts are at one in rejecting that universally discredited yet perennially seductive gospel of evil. Edward Morrow, writing about Churchill's remarkable wartime speeches, said that he had mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Andrew Roberts has done the same. Today, the sky is crowded not with Stukas and Henkels, but with the buzzing armadas of political correctness and the false and rancorous philosophy of identity politics. Like Churchill before him, Andrew Roberts has stood steadfast against the encroaching barbarisms that would upend our liberties in the name of fine-sounding but corrosive and enfeebling slogans. As Edmund Burke saw, this is a battle between civilization on the one hand and tyranny on the other. We are fortunate indeed that we have Andrew Roberts among us today to speak up for those besieged values. Andrew.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to have been given this splendid award, not least because three of its previous winners, Victor Davis Hanson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Dr. Henry Kissinger, I'm proud to number as amongst my personal friends. The other three previous winners are also people whom I admire hugely. At the risk of a severe attack of imposter syndrome, I accept it with grateful thanks. Edmund Burke has been a hero of mine for nearly 4 decades. I first read his Reflections on the Revolution in France when I was 18 years old, on board a ship, the Midnight Alaskan, on a diving expedition off the coast of Nicaragua, which was trying to locate a Spanish galleon with a cargo of silver and emeralds that had sunk on the way from Cartagena to Havana in the winter of 1704. We never found it, by the way. In fact, it was discovered 35 years later, hundreds of miles away from where we were looking. But instead, I discovered another treasure trove in the shape of Burke's insights on the nature of conservatism. And these have provided me with a star by which to guide myself in both politics and life ever since. My first essay at Cambridge University, delivered to Professor Norman Stone back in the days when undergraduates wore gowns to supervisions, was on Burke. My first edition of Reflections, published in 1790, is amongst the most prized books of my library. All my working life, I have had a 2-foot-high statue of Edmund Burke on my desk, so he literally oversees everything that I write. I even chose a single passage, marvelous passage from Burke's Reflections, the one about 10,000 swords leap from their scabbards in order to defend the honor of Marie Antoinette, to be read as the lesson at my wedding. You can imagine, therefore, how proud I am to receive this particular award. And not only an award named after my lifelong intellectual hero, but also one from the New Criterion, a magazine that I've read religiously for well over a decade, which, for me, provides a monthly infusion of wit, intelligence, fearless honesty, and uncommonly good writing. into a body politic, both here and in my country, that desperately needs it in our modern world of rampant political correctness, rancorous identity politics, and terrifyingly ubiquitous ignorance of the past. Roger, staff and writers of the new Criterion and supporters of it, I salute you. Someone else, besides myself and Roger Kimball and the staff of the New Criterion, who admired Edmund Burke was Sir Winston Churchill, who constantly quoted him in the House of Commons, wrote about him in his books, and saw him as a teller of truths by which to measure himself. In the third volume of his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, Churchill wrote that Burke was, quote, a great political thinker. He was able to diagnose the situation with an imaginative insight beyond the range of those immersed in the business of the day and bound by traditional habits of mind. There were criticisms of Burke in that book too, but ones that Churchill knew that had been directed against himself. Churchill said that Burke was a man of principle, but that he lacked a strong and well-organised party to support him, which of course was true of Churchill for much of his life, but especially during the 1930s. As Churchill said of his decision to cross the floor of the House of Commons, not once but twice, anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. Just in case anyone had failed to spot the connections between Burke and Churchill, Churchill made them clear. For years, Burke was a voice crying in the wilderness, he wrote, an orator to be named with the ancients, and an incomparable political reasoner. He lacked both judgment and self-control. He was perhaps the greatest man that Ireland had produced. The same gifts with a dash of indolence and irony might have made him Britain's greatest statesman, Churchill wrote. In the event, of course, it was Churchill himself who was totally lacking in indolence, but who relied heavily on English high irony, who must be awarded that accolade. Churchill reached for Burke at many of the great debates and moments of his career, happy to acknowledge his debt to him. He quoted him in the Free Trade versus Protection debate in July 1903, in his offer to Germany of a naval holiday from fleet building 10 months before the outbreak of World War I, and in his famous attack on Stanley Baldwin in 1923. In Churchill's 4th of July speech in the last year of World War I in 1918, he stated that, quote, the Declaration of Independence is not only an American document. It follows on the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights as the third great title deed on which the liberties of the English-speaking people are founded. The political conceptions, he went on, embodied in the Declaration of Independence are the same as those expressed at the time by Lord Chatham and Mr. Burke and handed down to them by John Hampden and Algernon Sidney. Ladies and gentlemen, it will shock but not surprise you that not one of those gentlemen just named are to be found on the history curriculum of British state schools today, a syllabus that leaps so directly from the Tudors to the Second World War that teachers refer to the phenomenon as Henry to Hitler. Amongst many of his lessons for Churchill, Edmund Burke taught him how to respond to violent political revolutions in general, and of course to the Russian Revolution in 1917 in particular. In his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, he stated that it was Burke who first showed him, quote, in the name of reason, irrational forces have been let loose. These were not easily to be assuaged. France was fated to undergo every form of revolutionary experience. The pattern has been repeated in other countries at other times, but not with very different results. France was the crucible in which all the modern elements of revolution were put to the test. Ladies and gentlemen, when a lot of Tories dithered, wondering whether the Bolsheviks might be even an improvement on the Mensheviks, Churchill responded by advocating full-scale military support of the anti-Bolshevik white Russian armies. Tragically, he found no one from the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, or from anyone else on the world stage indeed including your own President Woodrow Wilson, who claimed the white Russian armies were reactionaries and thus just as bad as the communists. Quote, "If I had been properly supported in 1919, Churchill said, I think we might have strangled Bolshevism in its cradle. But everybody turned up their hands and said, how shocking. As a result, the bacillus of Marxism-Leninism was allowed to survive, thrive, and metastasize until, according to the Black Book of Communism, it was to kill 100 million people. Even today, Marxism-Leninism can be found in places such as China, Venezuela, Vietnam, Berkeley in California, Yale, Harvard, King's College, Cambridge, where my daughter, who's in the audience, told me they still have the flag with the hammer and sickle behind the bar in the bar at King's College, Cambridge. And of course, another place that Marxism and Leninism still survives is in the fetid, fervent dreams of Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the British Labour Party. Churchill quoted Burke again and again to make his points. In a budget speech discussing the betting tax in April 1929, Churchill declared, I shall say with the great Burke, if I cannot have reform without injustice, I will not have reform. At a Pilgrim's dinner in July 1932, which was broadcast to the USA, he spoke of how the status of George Washington is honoured in the heart of London. His civic and military virtues play their part in the education of our youth, just in the same way as the eloquence of Burke and Chatham have influenced the American mind. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit with shame that George Washington's civic and military virtues no longer play a part in the education of Britain's youth, since the only Americans that they're taught about today are Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Senator Joseph McCarthy. This gives them precisely the skewed perspective on the United States and its problems that the educationalists who rule over the syllabus want the next generation to have about America. During his wilderness years, when Churchill stood almost alone in warning of the dangers of the Nazis, the shade of Edmund Burke was by his side. In his great speech of the 21st of July 1936, calling for the establishment of the Ministry of Munitions, Churchill condemned the government's inactivity, saying, we shall not be provided with the safety which we need because everything turns on time, and because, to use Burke's famous phrase, every single set of circumstances involves every other set. Where will others be then if you are late? What, for instance, will be the strength of the German army or the German Air Force in 1938 or 1939? Once war had broken out and Britain stood alone, before Adolf Hitler unleashed blitzkrieg on the Soviet Union, Churchill became a Doctor of Laws for Rochester University here in the state of New York. In a broadcast to America accepting the honour, he said, the great Burke has truly said, people will not look forward to posterity who have never looked backward to their ancestors. As he recalled that his maternal ancestors, the Jeromes, had fought in Washington's armies for the independence of the American colonies and the foundation of the United States. Of course, as dead white males, Washington, Burke, and indeed Churchill cannot expect to be honoured that much in the future, not least because they were, horror of horrors, for people born in the 18th and 19th centuries, prejudiced. I don't mean racially prejudiced, but prejudiced in every way. Edmund Burke even wrote in defence of prejudice in his Reflections on the Revolution of France, arguing that, quote, it does not leave the man hesitating in the moment of decision, sceptical, puzzled, and unresolved. Through just prejudice, his duty becomes part of his nature. Churchill's belief in the English-speaking peoples that they were superior to everyone else in the world, including, of course, the Germans, was undoubtedly prejudiced in a way that today would be deemed profoundly politically incorrect. In fact, it would probably justify a trigger warning. But in the context of the supreme existential crisis of my country in the summer of 1940, it did not leave him hesitating when so many others were, indeed, on the question of fighting on against Adolf Hitler, were skeptical, puzzled, and unresolved. It was Burke who wrote in his eulogy of William Pitt the Elder that the means by which Providence raises a nation to greatness are the virtues infused into great men. How lucky Britons were to have people of the virtues of Burke and Churchill when their country needed them to first win and then to retain greatness. How desolate we are that they have no living modern-day successors in the front rank of politics. I've already mentioned political revolutions and the House of Commons, so it's only natural that I should now turn to the subject, which is on all of my countrymen's minds all of the time at the moment. To say that Brexit has turned into a dog's breakfast seems somewhat unfair to canines. I should like to speak of it here tonight, not because I'm suffering from some form of Brexit Tourette syndrome, so much as a suspicion that the chaos and bedlam might have some undertones for you in your country. It certainly raises constitutional issues that Churchill and Burke would recognise in an instant were they magically to reappear in the chamber of the House of Commons. Your revolution of 1776, which Burke supported and Churchill recognised as ultimately being a cruel necessity, was greatly animated and justified by the justified cry of no taxation without representation. The situation that Theresa May's proposed withdrawal agreement with the EU would have plunged us into what amounts to regulation without representation, in that we would have had to have accepted all the diktats of Brussels' regulatory authorities with regard to goods and services without having any say at all in how they were arrived at. And this would have gone on, as we have discovered, almost too late, in perpetuity, as Brussels refused to put an end date on the so-called Irish backstop and refused to allow the agreement to end with the unilateral decision of only one party. As we've discovered over the past nearly 3 years of negotiations, Brussels considers it its duty to punish Britain for having the temerity to try to leave the EU, for fear that if we are seen to thrive outside it, other nations that have been similarly ill-used by it, such as the Eurozone countries of Greece, Portugal, and Spain, which have almost been beggared by the euro, might also want to escape. Thank you. In the course of these talks, the EU's chief negotiator has considered it acceptable to demand that Britain holds a general election, a power, by the way, that has even been stripped from the Queen and the Prime Minister under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, or a second referendum, hoping the decision of 2016 will be reversed, as the Italians, Danes and Irish have reversed their decisions in the past when pressurised by Brussels. We are therefore about to discover whether the liberal establishment's decades of teaching against British exceptionalism has worked or not, and whether we are just another European country that can be bullied into changing its mind by Brussels. What a wonderful torrent of ridicule would have poured forth from Burke and Churchill with phrases for the ages when Brussels' unelected bureaucrats arrogated to themselves the right to order Britain to hold a general election or a second referendum against the wishes of the British government, Parliament, and people. Instead, the most memorable quote of the entire process has been Mrs. May's phrase, "Brexit means Brexit," which has the unusual capacity of being both meaningless and untrue. The reason that the Remainers, who refused from the very beginning to accept the democratic vote of the majority, believe that it is acceptable to ignore the verdict of 17,410,742 people is the largest number, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, of people that have ever voted in anything in the history of the United Kingdom, is because, as they have often and volubly stated, they are cleverer and better people than Leavers, who they have denounced as nativists, racists, rubes, and idiots. I've lost count of the number of times that Remainers, not knowing that I'm a Leaver, have told me that the referendum result can be safely ignored because the Leavers were too stupid to know what they had voted for. They rarely have a reply when I ask whether that extends to Leavers such as Professor Sir Roger Scruton, Professor Norman Stone, Professor Noel Malcolm, Professor David Starkey, Professor David Abulafia, Professor Jeremy Black, Dr. John Casey, Charles Moore, and other Leavers who have more intelligence when they dine on their own than in some entire Oxbridge high tables. If the Remainers had accepted the will of the people as expressed by the majority, the Brussels machine would have had to have negotiated seriously and in good faith over the terms of our departure. Instead, from the very first moment, it took the Remainers' continued opposition to mean that there was a chance of stopping Brexit if only they made the price too high to leave, and this they have done. Burke wrote in Reflections how, because half a dozen grasshoppers under a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle, reposed beneath the shadow of the British oak, chew the cardina silent, pray do not imagine that those who make the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. Yet in the world of social media and online petitions, of the Times and Guardian editorials, and repetitive BBC Remain propaganda posing as news stories, which soon afterwards turn out to be fake. And in a world where a party can still call itself the Liberal Democrats while fighting against the democratic vote of the majority, in fact, nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, the half-dozen grasshoppers can indeed imperil the future of everyone else. We now have the situation in which Tony Blair has been inciting a foreign leader, President Macron, to hold firm against the requests of the British government over Brexit, believing that the whole project can be derailed. Something profoundly unpleasant has happened in my country over the past 3 years, which has come to a boiling point in these past few weeks and probably will stay at this heat for a good many weeks more. And that can be summed up as a barely concealed hatred of democracy on behalf of a considerable subsection of the political elite, those who lost the referendum. A very British coup d'etat is going on, with the Speaker of the House of Commons choosing precedents from 1604 to stymie the government, an incompetent Prime Minister unable to assert herself as, say, Margaret Thatcher would undoubtedly have done, and an overwhelmingly pro-Remain civil service leaking information to the newspapers, including such sensationalist stories that there are plans to evacuate the Queen from London in the event of Brexiteer riots in the streets. The scare tactics employed by Remainers, claiming that there would be no cancer medicines available or fresh foods on the shelves after Brexit, in a country that has the 5th largest GDP in the world, were not countered because the Leave side disbanded itself after the referendum victory, leaving the field entirely free for Project Fear Mark II. For all the previous economic projections by the Remainers from before the referendum to the present day, these have been shown to have been false. Warnings that we would have mass unemployment if we voted to leave the EU, i.e. immediately after we voted to leave the EU, for example, were swiftly followed by the highest employment that we've enjoyed since the 1970s. While our growth rate, which Project Fear told us would collapse by 10%, has actually been slightly higher than Germany's. If Brussels had faced a resolute, united Britain that had accepted the referendum result, despite 48% of them not liking it, it would have offered reasonable terms for our withdrawal, rather than choosing the Irish backstop as a principal bone of contention. Brussels knew that the relationship between Ireland and the rest of the UK had been a thorny question in British politics since before Edmund Burke was born. The one time that actual blood was drawn from Winston Churchill in the chamber of the House of Commons was during an Irish Home Rule debate in 1912, when a Tory MP threw a hardback book at his face. Ironically, it was the Parliamentary Rule Book. Over 3,500 people died in the Irish Troubles of 1969 to 97. Yet that was the area that Brussels unerringly chose to cause the maximum amount of friction between Theresa May and the MPs representing that province, who moreover provided her with the majority in government that she needed to govern. Now, I'm not, of course, suggesting that there will not be economic dislocation after Brexit, especially if Brussels wants there to be. Supply chains are complex. But the idea that Britain will lose 10% of its GDP, more, by the way, than it lost in either World War I or World War II, is ludicrous. Nevertheless, if, say, we lost 3% of GDP in the course of taking back control of our national destiny and ensuring that our laws would not be countermanded by some bearded foreign jurist sitting in The Hague, then I think the shades of Burke and Churchill would say it was a small price to pay. Any nation that cannot make trade deals with other countries, I think we would all recognise cannot be deemed to be a sovereign nation. Burke and Churchill recognised that life is not all about money. The appeal of Brexit is to the viscera as much as to the intellect. I personally don't believe that Britain faces economic pain and disaster from regaining its independence, so stupidly thrown away in 1973, but even if it did, it would still be worth it. Burke teaches us that true conservatism is romantic, appealing to the heart as much as the head, and appealing to both much more than to the pocketbook. Were George Washington to be told by loyalists, the 18th century American equivalent of Remainers, by the way, at Valley Forge, that his continued demand for independence might cost Americans 3% or even 10% of future GDP, he would have had flung them out of the encampment, and rightly so. I believe that the dream of British self-government will not be crushed, whatever this benighted, overwhelmingly pro-Remain Parliament comes up with this week and next, and whatever Mrs May might cobble together with Jeremy Corbyn, the communist leader of Her Majesty's opposition. I know that, not from the woeful performance of Mrs May and her government over the past 3 years, but from the words of Edmund Burke, the example of Winston Churchill, and the exceptionalism so bravely expressed by the majority of the British people in the referendum, the coming betrayal of whom will not soon nor easily be forgotten. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Well, Andrew, we have two things for you. One is everyone in this room will probably recognize this lovely shade of blue. This is a silver tray and suitably inscribed, and the exact right size upon which to keep a bottle of Paul Roget, Winston Churchill's favorite champagne, which I learned from Andrew's book. He started drinking in 1908. So that was good. And we also have for you, a first edition of Winston Churchill's book, Great Contemporaries. And I thought it was appropriate to give to you, who are our great contemporary.
Sorry, okay, something, ladies and gentlemen, something very, very weird and wonderful has happened, which you won't know about, which I'm going to tell you. I know this book. I know this book owing to the fact that I wanted to buy it and thought that I was a bit too poor for it a few weeks ago. This is a book that was owned by Colonel Frank Clark, who Churchill knew, and actually it's initialed with his initials at the front there. And I have a year ago I bought a copy that was also bound in exactly the same way of his autobiography, My Early Life, also initialed to Colonel Frank Clark. This is an extraordinary thing to have been given. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much.
So as we prepare for the last stage of our revels here, I'd like to invite my colleague James Pinero, the executive editor of the New Criterion, to come up and say a few words. James.
Good evening. Allow me to add one more Churchill quote to tonight's festivities. Men will forgive a man anything except bad prose. Well, it is now my pleasure to thank those responsible tonight for the good prose that you read month in and month out in the New Criterion. Here's another quote. Churchill said that he was devoutly thankful to have been born fond of writing. We at the New Criterion are devoutly thankful for that fondness born in our writers. You don't read the New Criterion for the pictures, after all. In telling the story of the best that has been thought and said, the New Criterion would not exist without the sparkling prose and sound judgment of our writers. Many of our writers are in this room tonight, and let's give them a hand. In our first issue of September 1982, our founding editor, Hilton Kramer, declared, "It is time to apply a new criterion to the discussion of our cultural life, a criterion of truth." For nearly 40 years, the New Criterion has delivered on this urgent mandate to provide a dissenting critical voice in the world of ideas. By recognizing the work of our great honoree, you honor all of our efforts. On the staff of the magazine, we are fit but few, yet working for a year, my colleagues assemble this remarkable event, all in-house, all while editing a publication that the TLS has called more consistently worth reading than any other magazine in English. Roger and I would like to recognize our colleagues now, and I hope they will stand as I call their names. Rebecca Hecht, Ben Riley, Andy Shea, and Hannah Niemeyer. Ladies and gentlemen, the editors of the New Criterion. And now for a final toast, it is my pleasure to welcome our chairman of the board, James Pearson.
Okay, thank you very much, James. What a great evening. It's a great pleasure to see so many faces here tonight that we've seen, and some new ones too, and to celebrate the New Criterion and the great important work that it does. As Dr. Henry Kissinger said, he's the first recipient of the Burke Award, the New Criterion has done more than any other magazine to preserve what Matthew Arnold called the best which has been thought and said. Thank you, Andrew Roberts, for those wonderful words tonight. I would be remiss if I did not mention that Roger Kimball today has been awarded a Bradley Prize for 2019. It's a great honor for Roger and for the new Criterion, and one that is greatly deserved. So let's raise a glass tonight to the new Criterion, to Andrew Roberts for those wonderful words tonight. Thank you very much, Andrew. That was wonderful. And to Roger Kimball. Thank you very much.
Well, as Prospero said at the end of The Tempest, our revels now are ended, but not quite. Please stay around, enjoy your dessert and the Paul Roget champagne, and join us in the courtyard for a postprandial glass of whatever tickles your fancy. Thank you all so much for coming.